She walked out of the courtroom legally innocent. But the moment the doors closed behind her, another sentence began. One no judge announced and no jury voted on. Death threats sent to every address she ever touched. Her face recognized in parking lots, grocery aisles, gas stations, and quiet streets where strangers suddenly stared too long. Bounty rumors spreading online. People tracking her movements. No employer willing to risk her name. No friend brave enough to stand beside her. No moment of rest where she could exist without fear. This has been her reality for more than 13 years. On July 5, 2011, Caylee Anthony was acquitted of murdering her 2-year-old daughter Caylee. The verdict was clear. Not guilty. The courtroom followed the law and the legal system released her. But the public never did. Because while Caylee avoided death row, she entered something far more suffocating. A life without doors that open. A name transformed into a symbol of rage. A version of freedom that means hiding indoors using aliases and living like a fugitive just to buy food. What Caylee Anthony lives with is not simply hatred. It is social erasure. A psychological prison with no walls, no guards, and no expiration date. A punishment that grows heavier with time, slowly stripping away identity, safety, and humanity until only isolation, paranoia, and relentless judgment remain. There is no parole from this. No forgiveness. No clock counting down to release. Only endless condemnation carried forward by memory and media. By the end of this video you will understand why Caylee Anthony's life after acquittal is often described as worse than prison itself. You will hear from psychologists, prosecutors, and investigators who followed her after the trial. And you will see how this case forces an unsettling question about justice, punishment, and the invisible life sentences society can impose. Stay with me because the moment the verdict was read, Caylee Anthony. To understand how Caylee Anthony's life became a permanent state of fear, isolation, and disappearance, we have to return to the moment everything began. June 15, 2008. A humid summer afternoon in Orlando, Florida. Caylee Anthony's mother Cindy picked up the phone and dialed 911. Her voice was frantic, confused, and increasingly panicked. Her granddaughter Caylee had been missing for 31 days. 31 days without a report. 31 days without a search. 31 days where no one outside the family knew the child was gone. During that month, Caylee Anthony did not behave like a mother searching for a missing toddler. She was photographed at nightclubs. She entered drinking contests. She attended parties. She got a tattoo on her shoulder that read Bella Vita. Beautiful life. When Cindy confronted her daughter and demanded to see Caylee did not panic. She did not cry. She lied. Calmly and confidently. She said Caylee was with a nanny. A woman named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez. Zani the nanny. A name she repeated so often it sounded rehearsed. Law enforcement immediately began checking the details. The nanny did not exist. The apartment where Caylee claimed Zenaida lived had been empty for months. The job Caylee said she worked at Universal Studios was fictional. She had not been employed there in years. Detectives walked her through the building anyway. Caylee pretended to swipe a badge. Pretended to enter offices. Pretended to know people who had never met her. Every layer of her story collapsed under the smallest pressure. On December 11, 2008, a utility worker made a discovery less than a quarter mile from the Anthony family home. In a wooded area near a suburban neighborhood, he found skeletal remains. The bones belonged to a small child, Caylee Marie Anthony. The remains were inside a laundry bag wrapped in a blanket. Duct tape was found near the skull covering the mouth area. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide by undetermined means. Caylee Anthony was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. Their theory was stark and brutal. They argued that Caylee suffocated her daughter using chloroform and duct tape. That she stored Caylee's body in the trunk of her car for days. That the smell of decomposition was later detected by cadaver dogs. That she eventually dumped her child's remains in the woods like trash. Also, she could live free of responsibility. The trial began on May 24, 2011 and instantly became a national obsession. Courtroom cameras broadcast every moment. Headlines dominated television and tabloids. Commentators dissected Caylee's facial expressions, her clothing, her posture. Nancy Grace labeled her the most hated mother in America. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse daily holding signs demanding justice for Caylee. The case became less about evidence and more about outrage. The prosecution presented a mountain of circumstantial evidence. Cadaver dogs alerted to the trunk of Casey's car. Air samples suggested human decomposition. Internet searches on the family computer included phrases like chloroform and neck breaking. They painted Caylee as a narcissistic young woman who viewed her child as an obstacle to freedom. Problem to be removed. The defense offered a radically different story. Led by Jose Baez, they argued that Caylee drowned accidentally in the family swimming pool. That Casey's father George discovered the body and helped cover it up. They alleged years of sexual abuse that conditioned Caylee to lie and dissociate. George Anthony denied the accusations completely. There was no physical evidence supporting the drowning theory. No emergency call. No attempt at resuscitation. No explanation for duct tape or prolonged deception. But the defense did not need to prove innocence. They only needed doubt. On July 5, 2011, after less than 11 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Not guilty of first-degree murder. Not guilty of aggravated child abuse. Not guilty of manslaughter. Guilty only of lying to police. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, screams, tears. Outside crowds shouted in disbelief. Caylee Anthony showed no visible reaction. She hugged her attorneys and sat silently. 12 days later, she walked out of jail at midnight into an SUV with tinted windows. Legally free. But the moment she disappeared into the dark, her real sentence began. The reaction to Caylee Anthony's release was immediate and ferocious. Within hours of the verdict, her name became radioactive. Death threats poured in by the thousands. Emails, phone calls, handwritten letters promising violence. Her defense team received bomb threats. Online forums and websites appeared dedicated solely to tracking her location. Any rumor, any sighting, any photograph was shared and dissected. A Florida bail bondsman publicly offered tens of thousands of dollars for information about her whereabouts. Others claimed far larger rewards circulated privately. Whether real or exaggerated, the effect was the same. Caylee Anthony was being hunted. She disappeared almost instantly. Her attorney Jose Baez moved her to a secret location somewhere in South Florida. She could not return to her parents' home. Protesters had gathered there daily holding vigils for Caylee, shouting insults and sometimes throwing objects. George and Cindy Anthony publicly distanced themselves from their daughter. George testified that he believed Caylee was responsible for Caylee's death. Cindy admitted she could no longer trust her. Her brother Lee severed contact. Extended family members spoke to the media condemning her. Former friends sold their stories to tabloids. Caylee Anthony was alone. For months, there were no confirmed sightings. Paparazzi searched relentlessly. Media outlets offered bounties for photographs. Private investigators followed tips across state lines. When images finally surfaced later that year, they showed a woman almost unrecognizable. Her hair was cut and dyed. She wore glasses. She had gained weight. Her expression was guarded, hollow, distant. The carefree party girl the public remembered no longer existed. Court documents later revealed that Caylee lived in a series of safe houses provided by supporters connected to her defense. She moved frequently, never staying anywhere long enough to be recognized. She used aliases. She avoided public places. She shopped at odd hours. She rarely left home during daylight. Every outing carried risk. Every stranger was a potential threat. Financially, her life collapsed. In 2012, Caylee Anthony filed for bankruptcy. Her debts totaled nearly $800,000. Hundreds of thousands owed to the IRS. Massive legal fees. Outstanding investigation costs. Her listed assets amounted to almost nothing. A small amount of cash. An aging vehicle. No job. No income. No future plan. She was dependent on the goodwill of others willing to shelter her despite the backlash. She briefly worked behind the scenes for Jose Baez's law firm, doing online research and social media tasks under assumed names. Even that was precarious. Any exposure could end it. But her legal problems continued. Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, the real woman whose name Caylee had used, sued her for defamation. Years of litigation followed before the case ended without payment due to bankruptcy. Roy Kronk, the utility worker who found Caylee's remains, sued after being accused by the defense. That case was dismissed. Texas EquiSearch sued to recover the money spent searching for Caylee based on Caylee's false claims. A judge ordered her to pay $75,000. She never did. These lawsuits forced Caylee into repeated depositions. She sat across from attorneys' cameras recording every word. She invoked the Fifth Amendment again and again, unable to answer even basic questions about her life without fear of legal consequences. Silence became her only protection. Occasionally glimpses of normalcy appeared. In 2017, photographs surfaced of Caylee at a political rally, her face partially concealed. She was reportedly working as a legal assistant for a private investigator connected to her defense. When neighbors learned who she was, outrage followed. She moved again. Investigative journalists later described her existence as nomadic and paranoid. She used multiple aliases. She avoided cameras. She left homes only at night or in disguise. Former prosecutor Jeff Ashton said publicly that Caylee would never live a normal life, that the court of public opinion had delivered a permanent verdict. Psychologists described her condition as social death. Legally alive but erased from society. No community, no support, no identity. Every attempt to rebuild collapsed under recognition and rage. Caylee Anthony was free in theory. In practice, she was trapped in a world that would never let her forget. As the years passed, Caylee Anthony's name never faded. It hardened. In 2022, a new chapter reopened the wound. A 3-part documentary released on Peacock titled Caylee Anthony, Where the Truth Lies, marked her first extended on-camera interview in more than a decade. For the first time since the trial, Caylee spoke directly to the public. She maintained her innocence. She repeated the claim that Caylee drowned accidentally. She accused her father George of covering it up and of sexually abusing her throughout childhood. She framed herself as a victim of circumstance, trauma, and a broken system. The reaction was swift and brutal. Critics called the documentary self-serving and offensive. Viewers accused Caylee of rewriting history without evidence. Social media erupted with renewed outrage. Hashtags trended calling for boycotts. Advertisers were pressured. George Anthony released a statement denying the allegations and calling them the same lies told during trial. The documentary did not soften public opinion. It intensified it. Whatever anonymity Caylee had rebuilt was shattered once again. By 2025, Caylee Anthony was 38 years old. She reportedly lived somewhere in South Florida, still working quietly for a private investigation firm connected to her defense. She continued using aliases. She avoided public settings. Sources described a woman with no social life, no stable relationships, and no sense of safety. Any romantic connection ended once her identity became known. Recognition always led to retreat. Witnesses who claimed to encounter her described constant vigilance. Scanning rooms. Seats chosen near exits. Sudden departures at the slightest hint of attention. One person who saw her in a bar said she looked like someone expecting an attack at any moment. This was not freedom. It was endurance. Psychologists who studied the case described her condition as chronic hypervigilance. A nervous system locked in survival mode. Dr. Paul Mattiuzzi explained that while prisoners lose physical freedom, they gain structure, routine, and predictability. Caylee had none. Every interaction carried risk. Every online trace could expose her. Every photograph could reignite harassment. She lived in what experts called a panopticon of public surveillance. Always watched. Always judged. Always one mistake away from chaos. Former FBI profiler Cameron Driggers noted that sustained social rejection can be more damaging than incarceration. Prison offers an end date, or at least the concept of one. Caylee Anthony had no timeline. She was frozen in 2011, permanently defined by a verdict the public rejected. Dr. Judy Ho, a clinical psychologist, observed that prolonged exposure to this level of stress can result in complex PTSD, depression, and long-term cognitive damage. The human mind is not designed to live indefinitely under threat. Financially, Caylee remained trapped. Despite reports that she was paid for the Peacock documentary, she had no stable income. She could not use her real name. She could not build credit. She could not escape outstanding judgments. Any attempt to profit from her story triggered backlash. Networks were accused of exploiting a child's death. Caylee existed in financial precarity, dependent on a small circle willing to risk association with her. And still the central question remained unanswered. What really happened to Caylee Anthony? Caylee never provided a consistent account. The drowning theory lacked evidence. The prosecution's narrative remained widely believed even though it failed in court. Former prosecutor Jeff Ashton continued to say he believed Caylee was guilty. Marcia Clark called the verdict one of the most shocking failures of justice in modern history. Legally, Caylee Anthony is innocent. She was tried. She was acquitted. The Constitution protects her from being tried again. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict was delivered long ago. Guilty. And that judgment carried consequences no statute defines. Supporters argue this is mob justice, that society has no right to impose punishment without conviction. Critics argue that moral accountability exists beyond legal standards, that Caylee's lies, behavior, and lack of remorse justify social consequences. Criminal psychologist Maurice Godwin explained that the case violated a core social contract: parents' duty to protect a child. Even if the law could not convict, the behavior was unforgivable. Caylee Anthony's story exposes something deeper: the way modern society consumes tragedy, the way outrage becomes permanent, the way media and memory combine to create punishments without end. Whether she is guilty or innocent, her life demonstrates the power of public opinion to impose sentences no court can control. She walks free yet remains imprisoned, not by bars or guards, but by recognition, memory, and judgment. A life sentence without parole delivered not by law but by society itself. So why is Caylee Anthony's life after the trial often described as worse than prison? Because prisoners have limits. They have sentences measured in years. They have routines. They have an end point they can count toward even if it feels impossibly far away. Caylee Anthony has none of that. Prisoners are confined but anonymous. Their faces are not recognized in grocery stores or parking lots. They are not hunted online. They are not forced to live under false names or relocate every time someone recognizes them. Caylee will never escape visibility because her punishment exists everywhere. Prisoners live within structure. They wake up to schedules. They exist inside rules that do not change. Caylee lives in chaos. Every day requires calculation. Every interaction carries risk. Every stranger could expose her. Every photograph could restart a wave of threats. Prisoners can imagine a future even if it is distant. Caylee Anthony cannot. She is 38 years old and her life is functionally frozen. No career she can openly build. No family she can reconnect with. No community that will accept her. Only isolation, vigilance, and fear stretched across decades. Perhaps most devastating of all is forgiveness. Prisoners can earn it slowly through time, behavior, and change. They can be seen as more than the worst thing they have ever done. Caylee Anthony will never receive that chance. No amount of time will soften public judgment. No apology will be enough. No explanation will satisfy the millions who believe they already know the truth. Every day she remains defined by a single narrative: the mother who partied while her child was dead. The most hated woman in America. That label is permanent. The jury delivered a verdict of not guilty. But the public delivered something else entirely. A life sentence with no appeal, no parole, and no release date. That sentence continues quietly every day. Not behind bars but in hiding. Not enforced by guards but by memory. Silent, invisible, and inescapable. Caylee Anthony was acquitted on July 5, 2011. She has lived in hiding for more than 13 years. Caylee Marie Anthony would have been 19 years old this year. Her death remains officially unresolved. Near the place where her remains were found, a memorial still stands. Flowers, stuffed animals, handwritten notes left by strangers who never knew her but will never forget her. So what do you think? Is Caylee Anthony's life after acquittal justice or something far darker? Does the public have the right to impose a social death sentence when the legal system sets someone free? Share your thoughts in the comments. If the story made you think, hit like and subscribe for more deep dives into cases that challenge our understanding of crime, punishment, and justice. Until next time, remember that behind every verdict is a human story far more complicated than any headline.